vehicles and platforms. The Russians and Chinese appear to be forming the basis for the payment vehicle within the oil trade. Consider it as a formal reflection of the Iran-India gold for oil trade. Bilateral oil for RMB sale plus Shanghai Gold Exchange equals gold trade. Note this triangle is precisely what China and Russia are doing now. Russian oil and gas is being sold for Chinese yuan, and then yuan is traded for gold at the Shanghai Gold Exchange. The trade is not complex at all. Oil for RMB for gold, creating a transaction payment in gold terms. The part unclear is posted margin to confirm and seal the transaction. The immediate implication is that the Chinese RMB will have a quasi-gold link. The original model use might have been the Iranian oil sales to India, with payment completed using Turkish gold. Such gold for oil trade appears to have been commonly executed from 2006 to 2010, and likely beyond that date. The jackass has been expecting that the gold trade note would be structured in a clever way, using swap contracts in major global commerce. It might be taking form in the triangle cited as the working template. Oil is the biggest commercial trade item. Soon comes the RMB-based contract for crude oil, traded in Shanghai. It will surely cause big waves, a major disruptive event. Standards and cycles anew. The petrodollar system has stood for 45 years. It has decayed into tatters. Its derivative foundation is being liquidated, a long painstaking process. A new disruptive model was forged in 2014 when Iran sold India oil, which was paid in gold, but delivered from Turkey. Gradually emerging is the gold trade note, first in oil payment then later in general payments in shipped goods. It is evolving within the Chinese market from Russian energy sales, all conducted outside the US dollar sphere. Gold enters the trade equation. Examine the many components for the demise of the petrodollar, the fading importance of the US Treasury bond, the chronically suppressed gold market, and the emerging structure of the oil trade among the Eastern superpowers. Grant Williams lays it out in wonderful style in a recent Zero Hedge article, truly great work. See Zero Hedge, here. Take it one step further. The Russians as primary oil producers have the ability to sell oil in RMB terms, accept the Chinese currency and purchase gold at the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Soon the Chinese can better organize their oil purchases from other nations. The vendors can turn around and do the same, convert the RMB into gold in Shanghai. The petrodollar has been effectively replaced with the mechanisms of a petro-yuan erected on the gold table. The Chinese are putting in place a link between oil and gold, once again like before the Bretton Woods gold standard was violated by Nixon in 1971. The gold standard is emerging, with respect to the oil market. The next step to standardize the entire global commerce with gold payments can be fashioned in much the same way. The gold trade note is coming into view, carved and sculpted by Chinese hands within the transacting of Russian oil. In time, ships bearing containers and dry goods will be paid in gold terms. It might be done with the RMB in intermediary function, but the conversion to gold will be ever present soon. The U.S. Treasury bond in its entirety is being deeply contaminated by the hyper-monetary inflation programs that have damaged the USD integrity for 6 years running. The gold trade note will serve as the all-in-one contract, the efficient omnibus contract which will gain global acceptance. Examine the components. It is important to step back, to observe the key pieces to the puzzle, to notice the decayed elements, to notice the new fortified elements, and to make conclusions on the direction of the path, which ultimately will lead to the gold trade note. It will be used initially to make payments for massive oil shipments. Later it will be used to make payments for massive container vessels, and for what are called dry shipments, like cement, grain, lumber, ore. Finally it will be used to make payments for construction projects and service contracts. The gold trade note is en route to supplant and to replace the U.S. Treasury bill within the global payments system. The US dollar has been incredibly abused, with monetary printing used to cover US gov deficits, to redeem toxic bonds held by Wall Street banks, to justify the US trade deficit, and to finance endless wars. Given the US dollar role as global currency reserve, the US dollar abuse cannot stand much longer. Its days as king dollar are very limited. Examine the components and key events. Petrodollar system has begun to break down. The correlation between the Saudi U.S. Treasury holdings and the crude oil price has broken down. The inverse correlation between the U.S. dollar currency index and the crude oil price has broken down. This chart, like the others to follow, is from Grant Williams and his fine work. U.S. Treasury bonds have begun to lose their store of value. Since the 1970 decade, the total foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries went from near nothing to over $6 trillion in the span of over 40 years. Nations needed to hold big quantities of US bonds and US bills with which to purchase crude oil. In the last 3 years, foreign forex reserves have been gradually in decline. The reasons are many, such as falling oil price, falling commodity prices, global recession, and disgust for U.S. gov fiscal policy and for U.S. Fed monetary policy. A grand backfire occurred in response to the Iran sanctions, with barter trade. Starting in May 2012, Iran began to sell a portion of its energy products to China for RMB currency, bypassing the petrodollar entirely. In turn, Iran used the RMB to purchase Chinese goods and services. The trade was worth around $25 billion per year. China then decided on a policy shift, no longer to accumulate forex reserves, with the finger of toxic blame pointed at the U.S. gov. The Great Reduction of US bonds had commenced. Iran and China had begun their barter trade. The Iran backfire amplified with the Indian oil for gold sale. Regional neighbor India agreed to purchase Iranian crude oil in 2014. The deal was clever, and sidestepped the blockheaded Obama admin sanctions. India bought the oil, but paid with gold bullion acquired from Turkey. The gold was delivered then to the large banks in Iran, which were not subject to restrictions. Only the Iran Central Bank was under restrictions. Crude oil was sold on a large-scale basis, with no U.S. dollars in the transactions. With barter and the oil for gold sales, the elements were coming into shape for the gold trade note. The nefarious bullies in Washington had been outwitted while giving the death sentence to the petrodollar, and a death warrant to the U.S. dollar. The Russian oil trade with China was the result of the Ukraine war, while Shanghai set up shop with the gold exchange. Consider it another gigantic backlash from yet another illicit war. The US gov and Israel kicked off the fascist coup in Kiev, Ukraine, but the joke was on the petrodollar, again a victim of severe blows to the groin. The Russians began both massive oil and gas sales with China, paid in RMB, but also energy pipeline construction to connect the two Asian nations. The construction would be paid in U.S. treasuries held by China. The great dumping had begun in earnest, called indirect exchange since third-party cash was used. Next came the introduction of the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Despite its limited price impact, the global gold flow chart has undergone radical change. Already, places like Tokyo, Seoul, and Dubai are opening physical gold markets. They strive to link their nascent markets for bullion to the Shanghai Exchange, which has rapidly become the largest physical delivery market in the world. A confluence of events led the Saudis to hasten their systematic sale of US treasuries. The Saudi income stream was reduced by the sharp decline in the oil price. Their war spending with the Yemen war also escalated, the hidden motive being to replace rapidly declining Saudi oil reserves. The kingdom had to dump US bonds in order to finance their deficit. They even began to issue bonds for sale to foreigners, a first event. Then in summer 2016 the U.S. Congress saw fit to permit lawsuits against the Saudis for their role in the 9/11 attacks. They had no role, but the U.S. government insists on creating scapegoats to cover the insider fascist role in the event, which was a gigantic bank heist at the World Trade Center. The upshot was that the Saudis accelerated their Rust bond sales. The petrodollar was being dealt a series of deadly blows, with the Arab monarchies all under great financial strain, the deep deficits the common factor. In the last 40 years, the foreign-held US treasuries went into overdrive. The total foreign investments grew to multiples of global oil output value. Meanwhile, from the opposite perspective, the official, mythical, U.S. government gold reserves became dwarfed by the gigantic volumes of floated investments in global cupboards. During the Reagan admin, U.S. treasuries were backed 132% by the market value of the country's gold reserves. Today, the amount has fallen to 4.7% only. The globe is awash in toxic U.S. treasuries, the infamous black hole often cited in the hat trick letter. Demand has dried up for U.S. gov debt securities. Thus the advent of QE by the U.S. Fed, the phony demand, the U.S.-based central bank buying the U.S. gov debt. Witness debt monetization, third world style. The major surplus nations are accumulating gold bullion, as they eschew the U.S. treasuries of past favor. Russia has been adding to its official gold reserves, selling off their investments during the conflict over Ukraine. In doing so, Russia fortifies its ruble currency with actual hard assets, namely gold. Also, China has been adding to its official gold reserves, under similar circumstances. A key switch can be noted. During the first 7 months of 2016, China imported about 30.5 million metric tons of Saudi oil, a 0.4% decrease over the previous year. By comparison, China imported about 29.5 million metric tons of Russian oil as an impressive 27% increase over the previous year. China moved toward the Russian energy embrace, while both nations added to their gold reserves. In the oil market, the Chinese are taking steps also, just like with the Shanghai Gold Exchange. China has moved to become the #1 oil importer globally, overtaking the United States last October. They are working on creating an RMB-based oil contract which would compete against the West Texas and Brent contracts, even the street-paid Russian contract. The delays continue but the outcome is written. Williams surmises that the strong oil price decline in the last 2 years indicates that crude oil is in the process of being priced in gold terms. Availability of gold in Shanghai has changed the paradigm. The pendulum that swung hard for over 40 years is about to swing back in the other direction. Consider the 3 major asset classes, namely gold, oil, and investments. With an annual production of $170 billion, gold is by far the largest metal market by value. However, that figure is overwhelmed by the oil market, which is 10 times larger at $1,720 billion, on an annual production basis. The U.S. government in collusion with the U.S. Fed produce a ripe $1,200 billion each year, plus another $400 billion in covered redemptions. The paper asset is in huge abundance, if not a global glut. Such is the nature of the U.S. Treasury bond black hole. The conclusion is simple, that the gold market is undervalued, that the gold price suffers from a scarcity in value. News's dollar and gold trade standard in time, expect an eventual refusal by Eastern producing nations to accept U.S. Treasury bills in payment for trade. The United States government cannot continue on numerous glaring fronts of gross negligence and major violations. These violations have prompted the BRICS and alliance nations to hasten their development of diverse non-USD platforms toward the goal of displacing the US dollar while at the same time to take steps toward the return of the gold standard. The new CIS dollar will arrive in order to assure continued import supply to the U.S. economy. It will be given a 30% devaluation out of the gate, then many more devaluations of similar variety. The new dollar will fail all foreign and Eastern scrutiny. The U.S. government will be forced to react to US bill rejection at the ports. The U.S. must accommodate with the new CIS dollar in order to assure import supply, and to alleviate the many stalemates to come. The United States finds itself on the slippery slope that leads to the Third World, a jackass forecast that has been presented since Lehman fell, better described as killed by JPM and XEX. The only apparent alternative is for the United States government to lease a large amount of gold bullion, like 10,000 tons, from China in order to properly launch a gold-backed currency. Doing so would open the gates for a generation of commercial colonization, but actual progress in returning capitalism to the United States. The cost would be supply shortages to the U.S. economy, a result of enormous export increases to China. Even if the U.S. government can secure such a large hoard of gold, like from Bush family and Rubin clan seizures of stolen Fort Knox gold reserves, the United States will be vulnerable from a $550 billion annual trade deficit. Its settlement after 1 year would exhaust all 10,000 tons, since at $1,300/oz, such gold tonnage would be worth $420 billion. The United States is truly trapped in an economic insolvency situation, with inadequate industry and a huge unresolved trade deficit. Failure to produce a legitimate bona fide gold-backed currency, together with an adequate industrial base, would mean the United States will be confronted with a real big nasty currency crisis. Any new currency, even with gold backing, would be subjected to a series of devaluations due to the enormous trade deficit. The result would be heavy, powerful, painful price inflation from the import front. The effect would be to reverse a generation of exported inflation by the United States. The entire U.S. economy would go into a downward spiral with higher prices, supply shortages, and social disorder. However, the rising prices would come from the currency crisis, and not so much from the hypermonetary inflation. That flood of dollar trillions has been effectively firewalled off. During the crisis that comes, the gold price will find its true proper value between $5,000 and $10,000 per ounce. Then later, it goes higher, as it seeks equilibrium in a new world where gold serves as the global arbiter in trade and banking and currencies. Hat-trick letter profits in the current crisis. As a Golden Jackass subscriber, I greatly enjoy listening to your interviews because it really lends a sense of passion that lies behind the tremendous body of information and formulation that goes into your monthly research. Though I must admit, it scares the hell out of me most of the time. Still, I will not miss it for the world. I feel that having a truly objective insight from your research, in-depth analysis, and accurate forecasts gives me and my family an important life-saving advantage. And I mean that sincerely. Michael's in Ontario. I have continued my loyal patronage of your excellent commentaries, not so much because of my total agreement with your viewpoints, but because you have proven yourself to be correct so often over the years. When you are wrong, you have publicly admitted it. You are, I suppose by nature, an outspoken and irreverent spokesman for truth against power, which differentiates you from almost all other pundits on world affairs. Paul, in Hawaii for over 5 years I have been eagerly assimilating any and all free information, articles, interviews, etc., that Jim Willie puts out there. Just recently I finally took the plunge and became a paid subscriber. I regret not doing this much sooner, as my expectations were blown away with the vast amount of sourced information, analysis tied together, and logical forecasts contained in each report. Joseph in South Carolina. Jim Willie is a gift to our age who is the only clear voice sounding the alarm of the extreme financial crisis facing the Western nations. He has unique skills of unbiased analysis with synthesis of information from his valuable sources. Since 2007, he has made over 17 correct forecast calls, each at least a year ahead of time. If you read his work or listen to his interviews, you will see what has been happening, know what to expect, and know what to do. Charles, in New Mexico, a paradigm change is occurring for sure. Your reports and analysis are historic documents, allowing future generations to have an accurate account of what and why things went wrong so badly. There is no other written account that strings things along on the timeline, as your writings do. I share them with a handful of incredibly influential people whose decisions are greatly impacted by having the information in the jackass format. The system is coming apart on such a mega scale that it is difficult to wrap one's head around where all this will end. But then, the universe strives for equilibrium and all will eventually balance out. The Voice, a European gold trader source. Willie CB is a statistical analyst in marketing research and retail forecasting. He holds a PhD in statistics. His career has stretched over 25 years. He aspires to thrive in the financial editor world, unencumbered by the limitations of economic credentials.